It's Wednesday, everybody. It's time for us to have a discussion. And looks like Holden's off the boat. So Holden will be here for the discussion. Yeah. Some opportunities there. But yeah, we got talked about the ASB audit reports. So if you remember when we talked about audit reports back in 417, I specifically said that we're going to talk about the PCAOB reports. And that was basically to spare you all the misery that you all had to experience on Monday. That being said, my assumption is that most of you are going to be sitting for the CPA exam. And so it was only a matter of time before you had to actually be able to look at this and understand it. Now, having spent a few years looking at this, these reports are not as bad as I originally thought. When I first looked at the new version of the report, I was like, this is insane. There's no reason for this to be as detailed as it is. But I'm starting to come around. I'm starting to come around and starting to think that there actually may be some rationale behind why we have the version of the report and these variants. And so I thought it would be important to discuss that today. And that's kind of what we're going to be talking about. We're going to be talking about what motivated the change to the ASB version of the audit report, and then talk about the changes from the previous version of the report and whether you think it accomplished the objectives that were set out. So first thing I had you all do is I had you read something, paper from the CPA Journal, which of course I get an ad to start out with. The CPA Journal, a little bit of older piece, a little article. It's a few years old, but it talks a little bit about the reason for the changes, and it talks somewhat about what the motivation is, but then just goes into the detail about the summary of the different changes. Now, for context, I did give you an example of what the previous version of the independent audit report said. And we're going to talk a little bit about this. My personal preference is I actually really like this. In fact, back when this was the compared report versus the PCAOB report, I thought this was more succinct and more to the point. But they made some arguments, some very compelling arguments about whether or not this is going to be relevant, and we're gonna explore those arguments here today. So the very first thing I want you to do is I want you to look at the CPA Journal article, and I want you to answer very basic questions. The answer is that let's see. What's going on here? Okay. I have my groups listed out here for whoever's doing this. That's okay. That's okay. We will work through this together, I promise. All right. So I wanted you to look at the CPA Journal article, and then I wanted you to answer a pretty basic question. And the question is that what were the changes that were made to that were made by the AICPA, not to the AICPA, by the AICPA to the report. Okay. So I can think of no better person to start out with than Tyler to talk about what your group came up with on this particular question. So what were just in summary, what were the changes that the article talked about?
Yeah, so we had like moving the opinion to the first part of the report, adding more titles, introducing PAM, expanding the disclosure of auditor responsibilities, and disclosing management's and auditors' responsibilities for going concern issue.
Okay, so yeah, good summary of the information. So let's just go ahead and go through each of those parts in our turn. Okay, so as Tyler said, one of the very first things is moving the opinion to the first part of the report. Now, logically speaking, if we're talking about the presentation of any particular piece of information, you want to have the conclusion after you've summarized all the details. So why are we moving the opinion to the beginning of the report? It's kind of a rhetorical question is what I'm asking. It's like, the analogy I used back in 417, I talk about it is say, would you ever read a book where the conclusion of the book was the first paragraph and then, or the first paragraph of the book, and then you read about what the conclusion was? And generally speaking, no. Okay. Generally speaking, when you think about how you read stories or watch movies, the conclusion goes at the end because that's kind of the climax and that's the goal. Now, the opinion is going to be rendered after some consideration and explanation, so it makes sense that the opinion will go at the end. Why are they moving it to the beginning of the report? And the answer is very basically this is the most important aspect of the report, is what the opinion being rendered in the report is. So putting it at the very beginning states the prominence of this particular item with respect to the rest of the report. Everything else in the report, for the most part, is boilerplate. It's language that's consistently used from report to report and people have seen time and time again. But they want to know what it is, what was the ultimate opinion being rendered here. And so that's one of the big arguments for moving that there. The second one, as the title pointed out, they added more titles. I personally think, I'm not sure how I feel about adding more titles. I think that they already had enough titles in there. But if you want to know what the specific sections are referring to, then it's probably good to delineate those. So there's an argument for that. Then we had introducing CAMs, or key audit matters. Now, have we seen something like this in the PCAOB report? So they're called CAMs in this report, but what are they called in the PCAOB report? CAMs, okay, but you have to say it differently because it's CAMs with a C for the PCAOB report. So critical audit matters. Now, did anybody do any digging into the idea behind critical audit matters? We talked about this back in the PCAOB report, and we said that for a PCAOB, these are matters that were brought to the audit committee or should have been brought to the audit committee that were material and required significant judgment on the part of the auditor. Those are the criteria for critical audit matters. And if you did a little bit of digging on key audit matters, it's basically the same thing. Now, they didn't say audit committee specifically. They said those charged with governance. Why is that terminology different for the ASB report versus the PCAOB report?
The ASB report is for non-issuers. Non-issuers may not have a board of directors, but they will have somebody charged with governance.
Right. So we don't know who is charged with governance. Specifically, they may not even have an audit committee. Where a PCAOB audit or PCAOB client, a company is audited under PCAOB standards, will always have an audit committee. That's a requirement to be a publicly traded company. So those charged with governance is more general terminology saying anybody who's in charge of oversight of the audit. So that was kind of the key there. But for the most part, everything else is consistent with the key audit matters. By the way, is this a unique creation that the ASB just came up with? Said, well, you know what? The PCAOB does critical audit matters. We're not going to be exactly like the PCAOB. We're just going to change the key audit matters because we're going to be different. Is that where key audit matters came from? Or did key audit matters exist somewhere else before that? They actually existed before that. The first version variant of these CAMs, KAMs or CAMs you want to talk about are going to be under international standards. International Auditing and Assurance Standards Board introduced key audit matters back in the early 2010s, and they've been using that ever since. And so critical audit matters are actually just kind of an adoption of that, but the PCAOB was kind of being contrary, saying critical audit matters, key audit matters. We want to be a little bit distinct about it. Then the fourth thing Tyra mentioned is the expanding disclosure of auditor responsibilities. This one is one that I could take or leave simply because it seems unlikely that anybody who's going to use this auditor report is not going to know, at least have some idea of what auditor responsibilities are with respect to a financial statement audit. And I don't know if it's necessary to include in the report, but apparently the ASB thought it was critical. There might be an argument more for this under ASB standards than PCAOB standards, because we're talking about PCAOB standards. The primary group of individuals who are going to use this are going to be shareholders and board of directors and investors in the organization, people who are already very well financially educated. We're talking about ASB standards. These are non-issuer companies. So these are companies that these are people who may or may not be invested in the company, may not have financial knowledge or experience in this particular area. So that's one reason we may want to say the expansion of audit responsibilities may be important for ASB standards. Again, I'm splitting hairs there, but I'm trying to speculate on what the reason is. And then finally, discussing management audit responsibility for going concern issues. Now, what is a going concern issue again? The going concern issue a good thing or a bad thing? Well, if we're saying we're a going concern, that's a good thing. If it's a going concern issue, that's a bad thing. That's concerned that the company may not be in business a year from now. So we know under generally accepted accounting principles, which is going to be what the PCAOB guidelines follow, that companies have a responsibility to disclose disclose whether or not they have substantial doubt about the entity's ability to continue as a going concern. Now, just remember a reflection from 417. If we're talking about publicly traded companies who are operating under generally accepted accounting principles, they are required under generally accepted accounting principles to disclose whether or not they have substantial doubt about the entity's ability to continue as a going concern. So the management actually has to make that disclosure in the financial statements. Auditor also has to make that evaluation and, if necessary, add that to their report. Now, does the same hold true? The answer was prior to this report, no, the same did not hold true for the ASB standards. And I said the same hold true, and I didn't complete the statement. The same hold true for the ASB standards. The answer was no. Prior to this version of the report, it didn't. But in this new version, now we actually have establishment of what the responsibilities are for both parties, and they're fairly consistent with what we see under PCAOB standards. So again, a lot of alignment, particularly with the international auditing standards, but especially with the PCAOB standards, there's consistency. Now, the format of the report is radically different, but I think that has to do with the fact that the audience is necessarily going to be different, or is likely going to be different in many situations. So that's why we have a different format of the report. All right. How do these changes relate to the Clarity Project or the earlier discussed in the article? So we had this thing called the Clarity Project that it's talked about in the paper, okay? And so if you remember, if we looked at that, so 2011, the ASB first issued its first standard in the Clarity Project, which was aimed at revising statements on auditing standards. The idea being is that they wanted to make the standards easier to read, understand, and apply, but not significantly change them, okay? So that was part one of the standard. Part two of the standard says that it was going to modify the audit report to substantially conform with IASB adopted standards. And part three was going to promote greater transparency in reporting to the standards. Now, part two took place in 2019, and part three is kind of an implicit statement in order to be able to conform with the other areas of the Clarity Project. So let's just go ahead and let's talk very quickly about each of these parts, okay? Now, does the change in the audit report itself meet the criteria of making auditing standards easy to read, understand, and apply? It's a trick question. It's like, is an audit report the same thing as an auditing standard? No. Okay. Audit report is an external disclosure to parties who are using the report. Standards themselves are the guidelines by which auditors operate. So this doesn't really affect auditing standards in itself. So it's not really relevant to the first part of the Clarity Project. So if you only read that far along, you'd be like, well, there's no alignment here. This is not consistent with that. But part two specifically says modifying the auditor's report to substantially conform with IASB adopted standards. So did we accomplish that in part of the Clarity Project with the new version of the report? Well, probably so, given that the new version of the report is very consistent with the IASB version of the report. Now, I'm sure everybody in this room, okay, I know I have, but I'm sure everybody in this room was just like, you know what, I really want to look at an IASB report so I can compare side by side. I want to make sure the comparison. And in your research that I know that you did, how many of you found that it was very, very consistent, okay? And everybody's nodding their heads like, yeah, we absolutely did that, Dr. Barnes. You call us out. Okay, yeah. All right, I didn't give you that as one of the assignments, but that would be the answer as we'd look at that. So we'd want to look at an IASB report and see if it's consistent. The answer is yes. The format is fairly consistent. It's not identical, but it's fairly consistent in the way that it's reported, because the IASB actually used the IASB report as a target for their reporting. And then the third one is kind of this the tricky one. Okay, so the implicit goal of the Clarity Project is to promote greater transparency in reporting to stakeholders. Does the change in the report, so the change from this version of the report to this version of the report, okay, does that actually accomplish that or those standards? That's a really, really tricky one. And that is the one I think we need to answer today. Okay, that's the one answer today. So I want to hold that up in the air and say answer, because I want to look at both the reports. I want to see, does it accomplish the third aspect, which again, the third aspect, promote greater transparency in reporting to shareholders. Do we think that the new version of the report promotes greater transparency? Okay, so let's go ahead and look at this file, all right? And let's go ahead and talk about each of the parts. So this is the way the version was, and you'll notice here, this is very straightforward. It's basically a page long. There's a little bit of information left here, and it kind of follows the format that we talked about before. So we talked about the unmodified report for a non-public company, to the issues of the report, manager's responsibility, auditor's responsibility, and then the opinion, and that's basically it. There's a lot of boilerplate language, not a lot of confusion here. All right. So with respect to part one, we can kind of punt part one of the Clarity Project, because remember, we said that this doesn't really relate to the standards, although this is easier to read than the other version of the audit report. So if we wanted to actually just use the easier to read criteria, we could actually make that out of it. All right. What about part two? Is this consistent with the IASB report? Now, again, remember, this is the old version of the report. This is the old version of the report. Was this consistent with what the International Auditing Assurance Standards Board was using? No. Okay. We just you talked about that and said this was the reason we changed this report is to be more consistent. Now, the question is this version of the report, this is the key one, this is the part three, is this more transparent than the version that we're about to look at? It's an interesting question. The answer is I don't know. So what does transparency really mean in this context? It's very easy to read, which I guess you could make an argument that if it wasn't easy to read, it wouldn't be transparent. That being said, if this is all boilerplate language that's used consistently across every single audit report, does that really provide any insight into the organization as a whole? Not really, okay? So this is one of those problems that we're running into. If we're using the consistent form and never adapting that form for new scenarios or new circumstances, then it doesn't really provide any insight. So I think that this argument for part 3 of this one is this is not a very transparent report. It's very easy to read, but it doesn't really provide any insight of the organization. So now we're moving on to question 4. Okay, so going on to question 4 says, I've got it in front of me, but I want to make sure I bring it up here. Refer to AUC section 700-799, audit conclusion of the reporting file in Brightspace. On page 35 to 37, you'll find the new ASB audit reports, including key audit matters. In your own words, how does this version report compare to the report that we looked at for question 3? Now, this is an interesting question because we just looked at that report. And I want to know, not this one, we just looked at this report. And I want to know, how does this report, or the new report, this version of the report, compare to the other report? So I'm going to ask real quick, the group leader, whose name I obviously know, and I'm not looking up right now, I'm scrolling down, that would be Leah. What did your group say with a response to this question about how these two reports compare to one another?
Basically, it did the big changes were everything we talked about in question 1. So like the main changes. So the opinion was moved, and we thought the basis for opinion section was a lot like better. So that was added, and then there was more detail regarding CAMs and like other information and stuff like that. So it was a lot more detailed. So we thought it was a lot more transparent and overall better.
Okay. So yeah, or we'll talk a little bit about, we'll get to question 5 about the Clarity project, but yeah, I think that's a good summary. If we look at what the goals were, we'll talk about in question 1, for the most part, it does accomplish those goals. Now, I did have a little bit of a note here. I was being pretty snarky because, again, I'm not necessarily sold on this particular version of the report. I said it's much longer. And we agree that the report, this version of the report, is much longer than the other report, which is definitely not good news for those of you who are preparing for the CPA exam. They're going to have to learn this report. It's like, okay, I want to go back to the olden days, Dr. Barnes said. Those times are gone, okay? You don't get to live in the olden days anymore, back when we had 1-page reports. It is more detailed. Now, from a CPA prep perspective, that's obviously frustrating, but from an investor or stakeholder perspective, that's a good piece of information because it provides more detail. It provides a little bit more insight specifically to the organization itself. What about this last statement? I said 3 words, okay? And I want to get your opinion on this. It's frustrating to read. What do you all think? Would you agree with that assessment that this new version of the report is frustrating to read? I don't know. I never got to the end, Dr. Barnes. I got to the first paragraph and kind of said, "The heck with this." Yeah. Or maybe there's something else with this. Who knows? Yeah. But yeah, it is very frustrating to read, to go through it. It's basically a 2-page long report, a 2.5-page long report, with a lot of details. But again, we do think that it does accomplish kind of the goals that were set out in part 1. Let's get a little bit more into the depth. So in your opinion, does the new version of the ISBR report accomplish the changes identified in question 1? In general, I think the answer is yes, but let's go ahead and walk through the parts of the Clarity project that we just talked about. So again, part 1 has to do with auditing standards. Again, these are making the standards easier to read, not the reports themselves. But if we're going to use easier to read as criteria, just in general, the answer to this one is no. This is a lot harder to read than the previous version of the report. Okay, frustrating to read kind of gives away that that's going to be the case. Now, that was not a criteria for the Clarity project. Keep in mind, I'm just using this as a general statement because the Clarity project said the standards themselves are easier to read, not the reports themselves. But it makes probably sense that we want to think that the reports themselves would be easier to read as well. All right. So then, part 2 says it's consistent with IASB, and the answer to this is yes. In fact, they basically took the IASB template and they evolved it slightly. So again, if you go and look at an IASB report, which surprisingly enough, they're a lot harder to find than I remember them being. I was looking for one when I was preparing for this particular discussion, and I was trying to find some reports out there, and it took me a good 15 minutes to find a good version of the IASB report. But if you look at the IASB reporting template, it's basically the same thing. So that's consistent with the IASB. And then the third question, the kind of the key question, is it more transparent? Okay. Now, here's an interesting question, just a general question, just for you something to think about. We have already said that this new version of the report is more detailed. Okay, it is more detailed. Is something more transparent simply because it is more detailed? Probably not. What do we need for it? Like we need I guess the question is that would we assume that something that is more detailed, that's the kind of a step in the right direction of being transparent, that we'd want more details in order to be transparent? But being detailed in and of itself is not sufficient to say it's more transparent. Is that a fair statement? What other what other guidelines would we need to actually promote transparency through this particular report? It would have to be unique in information. It can't just use the same language that every other single report uses, which, by the way, that's not something that they really accomplished, okay? They still are using boilerplate language. By the way, when I say that term boilerplate, does everybody know what that term means?
It's
So-
those little things,
Yeah, that's right. It says a plate where you put a boiler or you put a pot on. Yeah, that's right. So boilerplate language, the vernacular for that is basically saying it's the same language used over and over again. Okay, and that's something that the standard setters in for the CPA, or the AICPA and the PCOB, they say don't use boilerplate language in your reporting. They tell auditors doing that, and auditors continue to do it. What might be a reason that an auditor is justified, and firms themselves in their accounting language are justified in using boilerplate? Because boilerplate language is all over the place in accounting reporting. It's all over the place in audit reporting. I would say it's probably all over the place in tax reporting as well. What do you think the primary reason in the United States that we use boilerplate language? What's that? Liability. Very good. Okay. We are the most litigious country in the entire world, and if somebody finds a point where they can actually accuse of litigation because somebody didn't follow the guidelines, they will. So because we are so litigious, we're very, very hesitant to break the rules, or as we establish rules in a common law country, and we're going to actually talk about this in forensics in a few weeks, where we establish the rules in a common law country, judges actually set something called precedent. Okay, so if something is established to be correct the first time, it's going to be correct every single time after that. So boilerplate language is just a way of following precedent. And so that's kind of the argument they say for boilerplate language, that we know that this is effective because it's been used previously. We're going to continue using it. It's not even just a matter of being simpler and more to the point. It's more of the idea that we don't want to break any rules that we might potentially break by changing the wording. So yeah, I think that the transparency is a little bit suspect, but I understand the reason why it's not transparent. All right, so now I ask you all to do some research. So I want you to delve down into the different versions of audit reports, and let me actually get up here. Delve down to the different illustrations, and I want you to find examples of the reports reflecting the modified audit opinion. So we had 4 different illustrations here. Qualified opinion due to material misstatement, adverse opinion, qualified due to scope limitation, and then disclaimer opinion. And so I want you to tell me what the changes were from the standard unmodified report. Now, was this just to make you do busy work? And the answer is no. One of your goals is going to be, when studying for the CPA exam and preparing for this, is to understand what is the format of the modified report. You're going to need to know the components of that. If you know the components of the unmodified report, it's just a hop, skip, and a jump to understand everything else, because you're going to look at this and you're going to say, Dr. Barnes was really, really smart. And he said, let's make sure we know the changes to the unmodified report for every different variant of the report. And you'll just need to remember these, and then you basically got 5 reports in one. That was kind of the goal here in doing that. Now, I realize that most everybody in this room, actually everybody in this room, probably does not have the modified report memorized. Did anybody spend the time preparing for today's session saying, you know what, Dr. Barnes would be really proud of me if I memorized the unmodified report, so I'm going to do that. Did anybody do that? No? Okay, that's okay. I haven't done it either, so don't feel bad, all right? But that's something that you probably want to think about very seriously as you're preparing for the CPA exam, because they're going to ask a lot of questions about it. But let's go ahead and talk about what it is we need to know. And the good news is these are not radical changes. These are not radical changes. So we can actually delineate those pretty easily. All right, so let's start out with illustration 1, which is our qualified opinion for due to a material statement. What's your group say were the changes?
All right, so first up, the opinion section is now called the qualified opinion.
Okay, so a title change, yeah.
And the basis for opinion is called basis for qualified opinion. It has except for language in there that points to the issue. It doesn't actually have the issue in it. It just points to where you can find the issue. See, it says the rest of the financial statements are submitted fairly. It has an extra paragraph explaining the reason for the qualified opinion. It has omitted the CAM section. You can't report on CAMs when you have a qualified opinion.
Okay, that's an interesting point. I want to bring that up, okay, because it says on 209. So it does not have the CAM section. You're correct. You're correct there. But is that because we can't report on qualified CAMs because of qualified opinion? No, it actually says right here the auditor has not been engaged to report key audit matters. Now I want to bring that up. Could we have included the key audit matters section in here if the auditor had been engaged to report it in a qualified opinion? What do you think? Answer is yes. Okay, we could have included in there. Okay, but they just weren't engaged in report. Now, this is admittedly oversight, and I understand the confusion because why was it removed? It was one of those things you had to pick up in the bullet points. But this is an important distinction because we do need to actually make this clear from the extreme versions of the report. So you're right, the cams were removed, but it was just because the auditor had not been engaged to remove. Anything else we identified? Nope. Okay, so just as a summary, okay, we had some title changes, the qualified opinion instead of being the opinion section, and I believe the basis for qualified opinion title was also changed. The opinion itself obviously is going to change because we're moving from an unmodified opinion to a qualified opinion. What were the two words that you look for in that situation? You all should know this by heart by now, except for, I actually started asking my auditing, we did chapter 18 on Monday, and I said, okay, what are those two words? And I heard some murmurs, like, okay, you gotta say it a little bit louder. It's like, you guys should be loud and proud by now. You should know, except for, okay, all right. I'm gonna be next week. Everybody, what are those two words again? And everybody's gonna go, except for, yeah, all right. That's gonna be the goal, all right. So yeah, looking for those two words. And then, as Matt pointed out, there's actually a paragraph that was included that actually had to explain the nature of the qualified opinion. So every single time that we have something other than an unmodified opinion, there does need to be explanatory paragraph or paragraphs. I shouldn't say explanatory paragraph, but a descriptive paragraph that describes the reason for change. By the way, if this was 2 paragraphs, would that be okay? Yes, it can be fine. It can be 2 paragraphs, it can be 3 paragraphs, whatever the auditor thinks they need to effectively describe the opinion. Probably if they use like 30 paragraphs, somebody would come back and say, why did you do that? That's just ridiculous. But for the most part, it's not required that you use 1 paragraph here and 2 paragraphs elsewhere. You're going to see scenarios where you're going to use multiple paragraphs, and that's just whatever the auditor thinks is necessary to describe the reason for the change in opinion. All right, good. Illustration 3. Who's up on the dock? We got Dylan. Dylan, what's your group identify in this particular situation?
We said it uses a similar language as for a qualified opinion, except it says obviously adverse. And then that this one does not include cams provided by gas.
Okay, so title changes. So the adverse opinion, basis for adverse opinion, change to opinion. Now, what are we saying in the change to opinion? And when we talk about our unmodified opinion, financial statements present fairly in all material respects the financial position of the company. That's the language that's used in an unmodified opinion. How would an adverse opinion change? The financial statements do not present fairly in all material respects the financial position of the company. So it's just basically the opposite, okay? There needs to be an explanation for the reason for the adverse opinion. Again, they have it explained here. It could be 1 or 2 paragraphs, okay? But that's included there. And then no cams, okay? Now, was this one just excluded because they weren't engaged to report on? We don't know if they were engaged to report on, but it actually says the auditor is precluded from communicating key audit matters when issuing an adverse opinion. So as we said before, in extreme opinions, adverse opinion, a disclaimer of opinion, we are going to exclude for reporting of cams regardless of whether we were engaged to report on them. They're not allowed to be reported in those versions. Is that consistent with the PCAOB reporting, by the way? Yes, that is consistent with PCAOB reporting. Under PCAOB reporting, disclaimer opinion and audit matter, disclaimer opinion and adverse opinion, we cannot report cams either, okay? So that is consistent with what we know. So we already knew that to some degree. All right, going to illustration number 4. Illustration number 4 is on page 220. Tyler, how did they change this one from the unmodified opinion?
Yeah, so our group thought was similar to illustration 1. So they changed the heading from opinion to adverse opinion, basis for opinion to basis for adverse opinion.
Okay, so you're on illustration 3. We need to be on illustration 4.
Oh. Okay, opinion to qualified opinion, basis for opinion to basis for qualified opinion. And then they added except for to the qualified opinion, and a paragraph is added for the basis.
Good. So illustration 4 is effectively identical in change format to illustration 1. Can we agree to that? Okay, what's the difference between a qualified opinion for due to a departure from GAAP versus a qualified opinion due to a scope limitation? What's that?
Possible offense or no?
Yeah, so I'm talking about just general reason for a qualified opinion. So a departure from GAAP is basically saying the client did not follow the rules. We believe their financial statements are materially misstated, okay? A scope limitation says, we don't know what's going on. We were not able to do our job, so we can't actually issue it or render opinion in this particular area. Now, we talk about qualified opinion. we can issue an opinion over everything else, but for those things that we specified, we cannot actually render it, or we actually have a problem, okay? In the departure from GAAP, we think it's misstated. In the qualified opinion, we don't know what's going on, all right? But those two are characterized by 2 words every single time. What are those 2 words? Set for. Yeah, there we go. All right, yeah. I know I said next week, but I'm still working on it, okay? All right, so then we have illustration 6 as kind of our wrap up, okay? So, Leo, what did your group identify for the changes in illustration 6? And they were pretty substantial.
You gave me the doozy. There's a lot of
It's
changes.
because I have such incredible faith in you.
So basically there's the changes in the headings, which is the same for all the modified opinions. There's a lot of wording changes. You say engaged to audit since they didn't actually audit because I couldn't come up with an opinion. They basically state express an opinion because of what they going to discuss in the basis for opinion paragraph. So going to the basis of opinion, that changes a lot. Basically they add in a paragraph talking about why they couldn't, so like their actual scope limitation, their inability. They also kind of move a lot from the basis of opinion to the auditor responsibility paragraph. But in total, the auditor responsibility paragraph is a ton shorter. They take out a lot. So in general, it's just a lot different. The only thing that really doesn't change is management responsibility paragraph.
Good. All right. So yeah, a lot of changes here. Now, interestingly, these are consistent with the changes that we observed for the disclaimer opinion in the PCOB report as well. So a lot of these rules are going to be the same. So let's go ahead and just summarize these changes real quick. So the title changes are going to be consistent. The title changes for every single type of report that is different from a modified opinion. In this case, disclaimer opinion. As Leah pointed out, the very first line in the opinion paragraph says we were engaged instead of we have audited, okay? That is one thing to note when we talk about disclaimer opinion. When we talk about disclaimer opinion, we tried to do our job and we could not do it. So anything that refers to what we did has to be referred to what we were supposed to do, all right? There needs to be language that modifies that. If you keep that in mind, that will go a long way towards understanding this particular version of the report, okay? So obviously a change to the opinion. There's no longer an opinion that's saying we do not issue an opinion. There's a reason, there's a paragraph that explains the reason for it, okay? And interestingly enough, I want to go back to, let's see, let's go back to one of the previous versions of the report. So you'll notice that we did that explanation of the reason for the change in the opinion, okay, for the basis of the qualified opinion here. There was another paragraph right down here, immediately below that, that says the basis for qualified opinion. What does this paragraph look like right here? If I were to say, if this paragraph were to be put into the PCOB report, what would I call this paragraph? That's our scope paragraph, okay? That's our scope paragraph that talks about the detail of the auditor's work. And remember, if we look, we talked about the change that was really, really important. We look in the disclaimer of opinion, that paragraph is gone, okay? We've got a paragraph that explains the reason for the disclaimer opinion, but there's no scope paragraph. Does that make sense? So how do we characterize a disclaimer opinion? It's a pervasive scope limitation. And if it's a scope limitation, if it was so significant that we could not do our job, then basically that scope paragraph is no longer relevant because we could not do our job, which is the reason why this paragraph has gone away. The scope paragraph has to be deleted. As Leah pointed out, that's a good observation. The auditor responsibility section was greatly shortened, okay? So here's the section on auditor responsibility on the financial statements. If you look at all the other versions, this is like a page to or half page to a page long. All right. Why do we think the auditor responsibility section was shortened? Yeah. Yeah, we don't have responsibility because first of all, we weren't able to do our job, and secondly, we did not issue an opinion. So our responsibilities were completely and totally changed. And so that's really important to note. And then, as we said before, as we alluded to before, even if we were engaged to report on key audit matters in this particular scenario, we are not allowed to report on key audit matters in the extreme opinions. Again, that's adverse opinion and disclaimer. So some pretty substantial differences here. Now, this is the most complex one and the most detailed one, but if you spend enough time focusing on this, it becomes pretty straightforward in understanding those. But this is the one that's going to be the change the most if it's the type of opinion rendered. So understanding the differences there will be probably the most critical because the rest of them are pretty simplistic and straightforward. Anyway, yeah, so that pretty much does it with respect to this report. Now, like I said, reporting has become one of those areas that's become very pronounced in testing for the preparing for the CPA exam. I do think this is an area that you need to spend sufficient time and effort on. simply because it is fairly new. It's something that's changed within the past 5 years. And this is specific to the AICPA. The AICPA is responsible for these changes, and they're very, very proud of whenever they make a change or talking about or testing people on what those changes are. So please make sure as you're preparing and thinking about this, that you're focused on those changes and understanding what the differences are, because there will be several questions on that. Particularly, there will be task-based simulations that you'll see that you'll have to prepare within this area. But one last thing before you go, if your group has not yet sent me a summary of what your plan is for your end of semester project, before you leave the classroom, please make sure somebody in your group sends me a summary of that. Otherwise, free to go. We'll see you on Friday.
Kyle?